G'day, mate. 40 here. So it was good to get a few comments in the news media with the opinion of the overwhelming majority of American university students, and that is they don't appreciate these protests that are disrupting their ability to get an education, to get their work done, to move freely across campus. So while these campus protests have absolutely occupied news media coverage, but for the overwhelming majority of students, they're just a pain. And this is like very typical of the news media and life, right? So for the overwhelming majority of college students, these protests are simply a pain. They are an unwanted distraction. They are an interference with their pragmatic quest to get an education to move ahead in life, right? But it's creates action video, right? It's exciting, right? You get conflict, you get fighting, right? And there's something about fighting that's incredibly compelling. These protests unite Republicans, right? Unite people on the right because they already tend to have a low opinion of universities, right? It's bad for the incumbent, right? Bad for Joe Biden and for the parties in power because chaos does not work to the favor of incumbents. And these college protests split the Democratic Party because you have the overwhelming majority of Democratic Party activists are anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, but the money primarily comes from a tiny number of pro-Israel Democrats who are billionaires. Now let's get some political commentary here from Fox News.
In moments like this, there are always those who rush in to score political points. But this isn't a moment for politics. It's a moment for clarity.
Let's welcome back Otto Pohl to the show. Otto, long time no talk. How's it going, Otto?
Okay.
Excellent. So what are your thoughts on all these student protests that seem to be the number one news story in America right now?
Well, I haven't been on a U.S. university campus in a while. I think the last time I actually was on one was 2018. So, but protests are nothing new, particularly in spring. What makes these a bit different than most of the types of political protests you've had during my adult life is that there is a much greater crackdown on them for various infractions, property violations, vandalism, etc. than normally. Normally, they're pretty much allowed to just kind of burn themselves out in the spring. So these ones are a bit different. They're much larger, much more a lot more campuses in this particular issue. And as I said, they've come in conflict with legal authorities in a way that most demonstrations in the post-Vietnam War era at university campuses have not. They usually, I said, are allowed to kind of burn out or negotiate a end without excessive use of police force. And this one, these demonstrations obviously harken back more to the Vietnam era in '68 when there was police called to arrest demonstrators.
So a lot of the news media coverage says that these are the biggest college protests since the 1960s. Do you think there's something to that?
I think there's something to that. It's certainly, they're the most confrontational, right? So there were large demonstrations in the 80s about Nicaragua and South Africa and other foreign policy issues. But unlike the U.S. involvement in Vietnam or Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza, there didn't seem to be it didn't lead to nearly as much conflict, in part because I don't think most Americans really care too much about places like Nicaragua or even South Africa, whereas there seems to be a lot more investment now in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for some reason. And of course, in Vietnam, when they were having Americans drafted, that was obviously a issue of personal concern to male students who might end up conscripted.
Now, the Israel versus Gaza versus Hamas war began October 7, but these protests only fired up in the past 10 days. How do you account for this 6-month gap between the start of the war and the beginning of the protests?
Well, I think there were some protests early on. I know my alma mater, Grinnell College, had one early in October. But again, spring is the time when protests happen for a number of reasons on university campuses. One, it's warmer. It's not so cold in places like Michigan or Columbia, New York City. And two, final exams are coming up. The end of the semester is kind of ending. So a lot of times you get some demonstrations of ways to blow off steam. But they haven't been, as I noted, nearly so large in recent decades since the end of the Vietnam. Nearly so many university campuses being prominent. So here in the Southwest, the one we hear about all the time is University of Texas, where there has been some violent conflict between protesters and law enforcement agents. And again, the conflict there, I don't remember when I was an undergrad any of the demonstrations for ending apartheid in South Africa, or I think we're protesting for domestic partnerships for LGBTQ people at that. Well, they didn't have the T; it was just LGB at that point. But I don't remember the police ever being involved there. But I went to a fairly small college. But obviously, here, and I'm in a small town in New Mexico. Columbia University has been on the front page of our local paper for the last couple of days. So it's obviously caught the imagination in a way that demonstrations haven't really since, I think, the Vietnam War. And of course, Kent State with the violence between the National Guard and student protesters is often pointed as to one of the things that kind of made it necessary, although it still took quite a while, for the Nixon administration to finally end the draft.
Okay, let me jump in here. So for me, this story, among other things, it illustrates that there's absolutely no connection between what dominates the news and what is significant. I don't see much significance to these protests because foreign policy is overwhelmingly decided by a tiny number of people. All right, foreign policy is largely immune from popular discontent. For example, the United States massively subsidizes Israel, and that's not because there's just a groundswell of popular support to support Israel. It's because the application of strategy and money and influence by a tiny number of people has disproportionate influence on American foreign policy. The United States will go to war to defend Taiwan, even if 90% of Americans disagree with that. So I propose to you, Jonathan Otto Pohl, that foreign policy, in general, American policy with regard to Israel and Palestine and Gaza in particular, is something that is operated and carried out by just a tiny number of people and is largely immune from popular pressure. What do you think?
Well, that's, I think, largely correct for all of U.S. foreign policy. But there have been cases where this type of opposition has kind of had an effect on the margin. So they're usually pointed to the anti-Vietnam and then the anti-South African protests, right? So obviously there's lots of other things going on. If there had not been a single protest on either of them, we probably still would have had the same policy, because as you note, the people who are making the policies in the U.S. government are generally part of an established system. They're not elected politicians that are carrying out the policy from administration to administration. It's continuous on a bipartisan level. So yeah, certainly, and probably because of its entrenchment, at least since '67, but arguments in '48 as kind of an area in which the U.S. has had a strong government interest by the U.S. State Department and the Pentagon, that ultimately any changes and decisions are going to be from factors other than student demonstrating at Columbia or University of Texas or anywhere. But at the same time, I think it's meant to kind of be symbolic. And I think a lot of it is kind of try and hark back to more successful demonstrations. But I think it probably not so comparable, because I think in this case, the entrenched perceived interest of the U.S. Is greater than, for instance, it was regarding South Africa.
Now, I notice that life usually tends to run on hierarchy, not democracy. So for anyone who's had a job or gotten a formal education, you'll notice that democracy doesn't really have very much to do with how things operate. If you belong to a church or synagogue, it's usually not primarily a democratic institution. If you patronize a business, there's usually a hierarchy of who's in charge of that business. And so with all the news media talk about democracy, it's very easy to forget that very little in life operates on democracy. What do you think, Otto?
Well, this is true. Obviously, I mean, it's been a long-held cliche of the left, but it's actually true that in the most important institution in your life, your job, there's no democracy. You don't get a vote on who your manager is, right? You don't get a vote on whether you want an increase in your salary or not, right? So yeah, you live under a completely undemocratic and hierarchical system, 8 hours a day for labor. All right. So in a sense, this is really more accurate, where the rest of society exists as well, than the elections for congressmen. And of course, as you go further up from congressmen, you're getting further away from actual representation in the federal government. But even on those levels, right, as you noted, many things that the quote unquote democratic elected officials do are not really up for debate and decision by the population as a whole. And this is particularly true with issues that kind of in that intersection of security, foreign policy, and military policy.
Yeah. Now, you have familiarity with expert knowledge. You have a PhD. You've taught at the tertiary level. And is there not a code among the keepers of expert knowledge that if you really want to influence and affect those with expert knowledge, you really have to learn their code? Any thoughts?
I suppose so, but a lot of academic, particularly when you're dealing with things like literature or history, it's not really ever thought about that we need to influence political figures so much. But yes, if you want to influence your fellow scholars, you want to influence the people that rule or control the administration at universities, right? You do have to speak to them in their language, which is never usually a democratic language. It's usually one that is attempting to, whether true or not, center meritocracy and at the as its rationale, whether that's always the case or not. But very rarely is it where you see a university president or other administrator of university saying that they're doing something because that's the desire of the majority of the faculty, the desire of the majority of students.
What do you think about the idea that knowledge is a conversation through time by a tiny number of people with expertise in that particular area?
Yeah, there's something to that, but there's also the problem. You can kind of get lost from any outside beneficial influence. So one of the things that is probably most difficult in academic, but particularly history, is when you attempt to make comparisons, when you attempt to do comparative history. And it's difficult not just because you need to know multiple languages and you need to know multiple histories to go on, but it's also difficult because often when you attempt it, you really do come up with a problem. We have an apple tree and an orange tree, and what is similar to them is they are both trees. I remember trying to do something on forced labor under the Portuguese colonial rule in Mozambique and comparing it to various forms of forced labor in the Soviet Union around the same time in the 1930s. And I basically got to the tree problem. We have two trees, but the fruit is different.
Yeah. Now, I see something of a similarity between these meretricious campus protests and the direct Iran versus Israel war, in that the Iran versus Israel war so far has been meretricious. It's been very showy, but not much has changed on the ground, and yet it feels incredibly significant or portentous. What do you think is the significance of these direct exchanges between Iran and Israel over the past month?
I think it has shown that both those countries have the capability to strike each other directly. Now, so far, those strikes have caused minimal damage and minimal loss of human life. But as we saw with the war between Iran and Iraq, when the Iraqis decided to all out target the Iranian population centers, including Tehran, they caused a huge amount of death and destruction. So I think it's at the point where neither the Israeli government or the Iranian government are real enthusiastic about pushing it, because it would bring about rather drastic retaliation. Now, what would be the outcome, I don't know, but I was rather shocked that the Iranians were able to hit anything in Israel. The fact that they can, I think, makes it much more. The Israelis are much more careful about Iran than they are other states, specifically because of that possibility. So they haven't gone all out retaliation against Iran, I think, because they would like to avoid an all-out war with Iran, which is good reasoning as far as I can tell. I'm not sure how this will hold out in the future, because eventually it might be the point where the Iranians decide, for their order to save face, they have to make a significant strike on the Israelis, and then the Israelis will retaliate even with greater force, and you will have large numbers of fatalities and destruction of property.
So if there was an all-out war between Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Israel, I would anticipate tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. I would anticipate much of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv getting flattened, and much of Lebanon getting flattened. What would you anticipate in, say, an all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel?
Well, I don't know, but yes, but see, Jerusalem hasn't been flattened in a very long time. Right, so this would be something very new. If Hezbollah and Iran and other organizations opposed to the state of Israel are able to cause mass destruction in Jerusalem. All right, this is something that has never been part of the equation since the establishment of the State of Israel in 48, right? So I think this must, I mean, I can't get into their mind, but I'm thinking Israeli military commanders or generals are aware of this. And this is one of the reasons why they have been so cautious, right? They're thinking it's better to err on the side of caution and not have it escalate, even if they're confident that they could successfully win such a war against Hezbollah and Iran.
John Mearsheimer has an interesting observation that in world history, there has never been anything like the relationship between the United States and Israel, where the United States, seemingly against its best interests, is heavily subsidizing another state in a way that does seem to run fairly counter to American interests. Do you think that this is a unique relationship in history?
It's unusual. I don't know if it's completely unique. The United States kind of makes it self-unique from other large powers in that historically the idea of a foreign lobby of any place is kind of just bizarre. Whereas in the United States, already in, I believe, in 1935, you had Emperor Haile Selassie address the U.S. Congress directly for aid to Ethiopia against fascist Italy. Now, obviously, the lobby for the Ethiopians, which was largely Black Americans in Harlem at the time, was not nearly as well organized or as entrenched as AIPAC. But even then, you could see that they did have an effect. So we've had a lot of these foreign lobbies that have influence in the U.S., whereas domestically they wouldn't. The Cuban lobby is an example of a smaller, more regional one, but there's also some others around as you can find. So I would say it's more intense, but it ends up existing because the U.S. is unusual in being a major power that allows this type of influence.
And it certainly looks like Iran is a rational actor. There's been a lot of discussion that Iran is not a rational actor by people mainly on the right, but it sure looks to me like Iran's a rational actor. What do you think?
Well, so far, I think they've acted fairly rationally. I mean, they have managed to avoid, as I said, the type of retaliation from Israel that the Iraqis subjected them to during the war in the cities, war of the cities in the Iran-Iraq war. And of course, if you look at the Iranian actions, much more so than the Iranian rhetoric, they have been quite cautious. They have not been eager to escalate their direct role in the conflict against Israel. And I think it's largely because those people that are in charge of at least parts of the Iranian government are rational enough to realize that that would be a bad move on their part, that they would like to keep the number of missiles, drones, and other explosives coming into Tehran and Shiraz and other major Iranian cities to be as limited as possible.
Now, many of the Sunni Arab countries joined essentially with Israel to deflect the direct Iranian attack. It seems as though much of the leadership of the Sunni Arab world detests Iran more than it detests the Jewish state of Israel. Is that fair?
That's been kind of a move going on since the late 80s when the Arab League first put the Iran-Iraq war as a top of the agenda rather than Palestine. And of course, with the removal of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq and the U.S. Intervention in Afghanistan, Iran was able to project itself regionally much more so than it could. I mean, so its influence in Iraq and in Syria and even in Lebanon, where it had influence earlier, greatly increased. And so this obviously worried many of the Sunni Arab states, such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and places on the Gulf, United Arab Emirates. But also, we can see some of the Sunni Arab states that are closer geographically to the State of Israel, the Kingdom of Jordan and Egypt, have also come to peace agreements with Israel. So their conflicts before October 7th were more geared towards things that were happening elsewhere outside of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So that's not unusual. I think, though, it set it back. So I think I don't think you're going to see movement on normalization with Israel continuing the way it was among the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the two countries that looked like they were going to fully normalize diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, which would have made the number of countries with at least a cold peace rather than a cold war with Israel in the region much greater.
And what's going on with the Saudi versus Iran conflict? Did China successfully broker a peace? Is that being fought out in other ways? What's going on in that struggle?
Well, I think what happened with that struggle, and again, I don't have a way of looking into the minds of any of the people, but that the new leadership in Saudi Arabia took a look at failed policies it had, including unrelenting hostility towards Iran. So like the earlier policy of normalizing with Israel, it put on a policy to normalize with Iran. So one of the things you find with successful states, right, is that their resources are used for internal development, not external conflict. And so Saudi Arabia had a lot of oil resources, but you can't always say they were always being used most beneficially for the population of Saudi Arabia. So I think that's part of the move. I mean, obviously for political reasons now, I said the normalization between the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Israel, is going to be on hold. But had the war in Gaza not started, I think you would have seen the continuation of normalization just because the Arab states there had come to the conclusion that they were better ways to use their resources than being in conflict with other powers.
So is it fair to say that overwhelmingly the Arab street is hostile to the Jewish state, but once again, popular opinion has very little sway over the decision makers who decide foreign policy for the leading Arab states?
Well, that's been true for a very long time. So even in 1948, right, there's an agreement between the Kingdom of Jordan and the State of Israel under Ben Gurion that the Jordanians get to annex the West Bank, right, that they get to take it. And then the Egyptians take for administration Gaza Strip. But you have there more working agreements between Amman and Jerusalem than between Amman and the Palestinians. There isn't any independent Palestinian organization that is able to talk to the Arab governments until 1964, which is when the PLO was formed. All right, so that's a number of years after the 48 war and even the 56 war. It takes a while for the Palestinian organizations to even be able to have a platform to which they can try and address other Arab governments. So this isn't new at all, that there would be popular support for the Palestinian cause by masses, although how deep that is in the Arab world, I don't know. When I was in Iraq, it was pretty shallow. And of course, as I said, most of these Arab governments don't pretend to be democratic, so they don't need to really work with the populace. Many are outright monarchies, as is Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, right? But if you put it to a referendum in Jordan, should they get rid of the peace treaty with Israel, the referendum might pass, but it's not in any danger because Jordan isn't democratic, and King Abdullah II is not going to change that.
Now, when the Palestinians have emigrated from Palestine and moved to places like Jordan and Lebanon, they've been incredibly destabilizing, and Egypt is absolutely terrified of the destabilizing effect of Palestinians. Is that fair? Is that true? Is that what's going on?
Well, historically, yes. I mean, obviously, there was a civil war, although with the PFLP spokesman, Hassan Kanafi, said it's not a civil war, but right, there was the Palestinians fighting against the Jordanian army, and eventually the Palestinian armed organizations are expelled from Jordan into Lebanon, and then they become a faction in the Lebanese civil war, and one of the contributing catalysts for the breakdown of Lebanon. And you have the Israeli intervention in '82, and then the PLO is again evacuated, this time into Tunisia. They don't seem to have destabilized Tunisia in the same way they did Jordan and Lebanon. But certainly it's a possibility that you could see unrest coming from pro-Palestinian movements and factions in Egypt, demanding the Egyptians do something about the situation in Rafah, and particularly in the southern Gaza Strip, but maybe even move away from the cold peace to more cold war. I don't think, again, it's going to happen, because as even in the United States, these types of things are not decided by popular opinion. But certainly, yes, the Arab governments have always been less militant, less hostile to the state of Israel than much of their populations. And there are some exceptions, but when we're talking about countries like Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, the populace is considerably more anti-Zionist than the regimes in power.
And the people in power in Egypt, what is their attitude towards Palestinians? For example, Gaza is often referred to as an open-air prison, and half the reason for that is that Egypt wants absolutely no Palestinians coming into their territory. Egypt keeps up half of that prison. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, we were just talking about it. Obviously, we look at what happened in Jordan and Lebanon. Why would the Egyptian government, which already has plenty of problems, want 2 million people who are impoverished and have a goal of returning, if necessary, by force of arms to their homeland? Right. So these types of diasporas have caused problems elsewhere. The Palestinians are notable in the 20th century because it's happened a number of times, Jordan and Lebanon being the two big ones. But you saw this after 72, the exiles from Burundi wanting to come back after their expulsion. So you had that, and you even had it to a lesser and much more peaceful extent in Germany, where a number of the expellee organizations, but particularly those from the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, had considerable political power early on in the BRD, particularly in Bavaria, so they could kind of push policy towards their particular goals. So it sticks out more, mainly because of what happened in Jordan and Lebanon, where you actually had serious fighting between Palestinians and those Arab governments, or factions in those Arab governments. Obviously, the Lebanese army was not the main armed force in the Lebanese civil war. There were a number of militias that were considerably more effective.
And what's Turkey's attitude, say, towards the Iran-Israel conflict?
Whose attitude?
Turkey, country of Turkey.
I don't know. Turkey historically was fairly close to the state of Israel. They were one of the only Islamic countries for a long time to have full diplomatic relations with Israel. Erdogan has, since coming to power, has moved that away somewhat. But Turkey also has never really been friends, going back to the conflict between the Safavids and the Ottomans with Iran or Persia. And most of their interest in Iraq is using the two northern vilayets of the Kurdish region, Dohuk and Erbil, as a huge market for their export goods. So one of the largest markets for the export of goods manufactured in Turkey is Iraqi Kurdistan.
You used to live in Iraq. What's the quality of life like in Iraq now compared to when Saddam Hussein was in power?
It depends who you're talking about. But as a general rule, it's gone down because the same reason you had a collapse of standard of living in the Soviet Union after it collapsed and Yeltsin came to power in Russia, is much of the infrastructure that was built, things like hospitals, have collapsed. Education is another sector that's collapsed. So these things that are important to these kind of socialist state-centered regimes tend to be the first to lose any type of funding and support when things start to collapse. So you don't have nearly as good of health care for a lot of people, and you don't have as good a housing for a lot of people. That was much more accessible to people through subsidies and whatnot. And the general educational system has suffered greatly. So a lot of these regimes were pretty good at teaching basic math and science and languages, even if other parts of the curriculum were tightly politically controlled. But now it's hard to find a good school that can teach basic math in a lot of these places.
And what's going on with the Kurds these days?
As far as I know, they are still suffering the same problems that they have always, and that is they are divided. So there hasn't been any successful movement to either get full independence for the Kurdish region in Iraq from Iraq itself. all such movements tend to fizzle out, and there hasn't been any movement to really get independence for the other regions. So there are small guerrilla movements still operating in Rojava, which is Syrian Kurdistan, and Bakur, which is Turkish Kurdistan, and even Rojalat, the Iranian part of Kurdistan. But it doesn't look like any of them are going to be successful, particularly not in Turkey, where the regime is strongest vis-a-vis the Kurdish guerrillas. So they haven't really come up with a solution. A lot of Kurdish intellectuals come up with what they consider alternatives to creating a Kurdish nation state. But like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I don't think those are really viable. I think if they want to exist as a national entity with self-determination, their best bet would probably be to increase real autonomy in the Iraqi portion. But a lot of this is the problem of economics, is that neither the government in Baghdad or the U.S. government want to see a separate Kurdistan. We'd like to have the remain part of Iraq for largely economic reasons. And there is a good argument to be made that if Kurdistan did become fully independent, that it would result in a considerable lowering of the standard of living.
And is there a name for the hatred that wants to deny the Kurdish people national self-determination?
I think you just call it anti-Kurdism. But yeah, I suppose it's just anti-Kurdish sentiment. But the thing is, the anti-Kurdish sentiment, unlike a lot of other sentiments, is not just held by one group. So in Iraq and Syria, the main dominating ethnic group that has been in conflict with the Kurds are the Arabs. And of course, the Syrian Ba'athists and the Iraqi Ba'athists didn't get along, in part because of the religion, but largely just because of conflicting hegemony. But also the Turks and the Persians don't want to have independent Kurdistan either. And there's no love lost between Persians and Arabs, or Persians and Turks, or Turks and Arabs. None of these groups have really been friendly towards each other in recorded history. So once they started getting a state formation, this formation tended to be used by whatever the dominant ethnic group is. And the Kurds have not had a full nation state in modern times that can compete with the Turks or the Arabs or the Persians. So they are much closer in their situation to people like the Assyrians, who aren't ever going to get a independent state because they claim the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And I don't see Iraqi Arabs ever giving that up.
So back in 2014, 2015, 2016, Arab Muslim immigration to Europe was a huge story that particularly dominated right-wing discourse. And so we're now 8 years on from that, and I'm wondering, is there reason to believe that, say, the second generation of Muslims who've immigrated to Europe will go down the same sort of secular path that Christians and Jews in Europe have gone? So 2 or 3 generations ago, Europe was at least ostensibly Christian. Now it's overwhelmingly secular. Is there reason to believe that Muslims are immune from the secularization trends once they move to a continent such as Europe?
Oh, again, I think you're going to have to divide this. So there has been a lot of secularization among the earliest Muslim immigrants, the Turks. although they're still considerably less secularized than the Germans and other Europeans. The later waves coming from Syria and North Africa, I think you have to wait a while. They are obviously far less secularized than the Turks. And part of the reason the Turks are more secularized is because there was a massive secularization in Turkey itself, starting in the 1920s under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And that varies in the Arab states, but it was never, even the most secular kind of pan-Arabist nationalist like Nasser and Saddam Hussein made far more concessions to Islam than Ataturk did in the Turkish Republic.
So are we building prospects for peace between, say, Israel and the Palestinians, or are those prospects for peace even more remote today as compared to 5, 10, 20 years ago?
I'm going to say it's more remote. So, I mean, I'm not even sure what a solution would look like at this point. The kind of highlight of finally there would be a solution was during the Oslo negotiations, when it was hoped that they could kind of piecemeal create a small Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip that would serve to give statehood to the Palestinian Arabs. I don't think anybody's talking about that right now because of the conflict. So the idea right now, if you were to say that we should just give Gaza and the West Bank to Hamas, right? I don't think that's going to get any support from the current Israeli government. So I'm not sure exactly what it would be. I haven't seen any proposals by the conflicting powers themselves as to any type of viable solution. Neither Hamas nor the Israeli government have put forth anything to me that looked like it would be a starting point for negotiation. So I'm not sure how this would proceed. I mean, there might be something out there, but to me, it looks like the negotiations with the Palestinian Authority weren't accepted by Hamas, and Hamas, having been kind of cut out of the talks, did make a bold move to make sure they didn't become a non-actor. But by doing that, they made their likelihood of them being invited to any peace talks far less.
Yeah. So how long have you lived in New Mexico?
3 years now.
And how would you compare the quality of life in New Mexico, say, compared to California? How's life different in New Mexico?
Well, it's a lot less expensive here, particularly rent. So it's hard to tell. The area of New Mexico I live in is not typical. You probably find more typical New Mexico in Albuquerque or Santa Fe, which are the two largest cities. But I don't dislike New Mexico. I like the warm weather, but there's not a lot of economic opportunity if you have a PhD in history.
Right. And are you able to pursue your scholarly endeavors?
Somewhat. I mean, I'll do stuff if people ask me to. I have a article I'm supposed to write on the Crimean Tatars for a publication out of Poland, but I'm pretty much retired, both because there's really no money in it, and two, I pretty much said most of everything I wanted to say regarding my area of specialty, which is largely ethnic Germans and some other deported peoples in the Soviet Union during the 30s and 40s. So when you in academia, when you get these little narrow niches, at some time you kind of run out of important things to say.
Yeah. And now, what's going on with your health? You look pretty healthy.
Well, I have since I took on the job as a janitor, lost a lot of weight. I'm physically active about 8 hours a day, so I'm in pretty good shape as far as that's concerned. I did have to cut out sugar. The doctor said that I was headed toward diabetes, but so far that's been pretty good. So yeah, my health is better than it was as a teacher or professor because there's a lot less stress, and I'm not nearly as sedentary. And I've done some stuff to improve my diet. I did cut out all the processed sugar, and that helped a lot.
And do you feel good?
I feel pretty good, yeah. Yeah, so finally got health insurance after the first year, and so then I had to do something I've been putting off for a while. That was the colonoscopy, which was not my favorite thing. So my next step, now that I've got the dental insurance, is to get my teeth fixed. So I finally found a dentist, so I will be doing that soon.
If you could go back in time, instead of doing a PhD in history, would there be another field that you might have chosen instead?
Yeah, I think I would have become a cook or something more in demand. I don't know what it is, but I mean, I sometimes I still look at the job listings, and there's like nothing in my geographical field for history being hired right now. So I don't know if that's because of money or because of interest, but if you deal with areas like Central Asia, when there's the very, very few openings ever advertised anymore.
And do you spend much time perusing the musings of thousands of other people with PhDs who've been unable to land a career in academia?
A little bit, not a whole bunch. I mean, I've seen some of them. I know what's from St. Louis, Sarah Kenzador was an anthropologist that dealt with Uzbekistan, who couldn't get academic position and became famous in popular writing. But I haven't. No, I have, as I said, in addition to it just not being worth the effort anymore to try and find any jobs to even apply to, yet alone apply to them. I've kind of said what I wanted to say. So I mean, my last book came out 2 years ago. It's pretty much used about 10 years worth of archival and other forms of research, including some interviews. And unfortunately, it's still only in 629 libraries. But no, I've decided to kind of go on and do other things. So recently, I have started a band with a 70-year-old guitarist, and we have done one show, and we made $1 in tips. So if we can double it every month, I'll be happy.
You've got an essay on top of your Substack, Deborah Lipstadt and the Denial of Soviet Ethnically Targeted Deportations and Killings. Could you talk to me about this essay?
Well, she just wrote in her 93 book that no citizen of the Soviet Union assumed that death and deportation were inevitable as a result of their ethnicity. So she claimed that all of the terror was arbitrary, but a lot of it was actually targeted on the basis of nationalnost, starting as early as 1937, when all of the ethnic Koreans are moved from the Soviet Far East into Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to prevent them from being cover for ethnic Koreans sent from the Japanese Empire as spies.
Okay, and what have you been doing on your YouTube channel?
Not much. I haven't really. As I said, other things have replaced it, so I haven't put anything up there in a while. As I said, I've kind of running out of things to say. As I said, the PhDs are narrow enough that you probably after. So now it's been for me what 20 something 25 years. 25 years is about all I can sustain on one subject.
And you've got an essay here on your Substack, Radical Right Reaction in Europe and the United States in Comparative Perspective. So what are some of the ways that the radical right are similar and different between America and Europe?
Well, it's mostly how they're different, but I mean, there isn't a historically a strong socialist or workerist movement in the U.S. And this really distinguishes it from Europe in all types of manner. But it does certainly with the type of reaction you have. So, but both Italian fascists and even more so German National Socialists, as well as later radical right movements in Europe, have always had this kind of workers streak in it. Sometimes quite pronounced, like in the Strasser brothers, but certainly more so than the United States, where everything tends to be free market capitalism, which kind of Manchester liberalism. But that's not what you see in the European right-wing movements, which tend to be much more nationally based, and then consider the working class of the nation to be an integral part of that. So they're not merely in support of unrestrained capitalism. And so in that sense, the base for having a reactionary movement in Europe has always been much larger, right? So you don't have a division within the historically within like the German nation or the Swedish nation that denies the existence of class problems, right? So in the U.S. is kind of a denial that there is even such a thing as a white working class that has its own interest, whereas the nationalist movements, I think, in Europe since the 1920s, even to today, have always considered that to be the movement, to be part of the movement, that it's not just, the nation isn't just the bourgeoisie.
Yeah. Okay, Otto, I'm going to start to wrap things up. Do you have any final words for today?
No. Thanks for having me on. And unfortunately, I can't see into the minds of any of the Middle Eastern leaders, so I don't know what's going to happen. And some of these guys are pretty complex in their thinking, but it would be nice to know what is going to happen. But I think you are definitely right on the populist thing. Obviously, university students are not going to change the State Department policy, at least not in 1 year.
Yeah. Okay, Otto, I'll talk to you another day. Thank you. Thanks for coming by.
Problem. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye. And let me play a little something from Fox News.
Worry about the left, because this is a movement from the left. These are radical left lunatics. And they got to be stopped now, because it's going to go on, and it's going to get worse and worse.
The current president, the former president, reacting to all of these demonstrations. The New York Times writing it this way: Biden denounces violence on campus, breaking silence after rash of arrests. President Biden broke days of silence on Thursday to finally speak out on the wave of anti-Israel protests on American college campuses that have inflamed much of the country, denouncing violence and anti-Semitism, even as he defended the right to peaceful dissent.
Right, so anarchy and chaos works against the interests of the incumbent. Also, these protests unite Republicans and divide Democrats. And the media just absolutely fixated on them, even though I think they have very little significance beyond the action video.
Since April 18th, if you look at this map, police have arrested or detained roughly 2,000 people during protests on at least 44 college campuses.
Right, but most of these arrests are in Democratic Party strongholds. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that many of the people arrested are not even going to get charged. And of those who get charged, the punishments that they face will be minimal. And if you don't crack down on illegal behavior, right, you just incentivize more of it.
Across 24 states. One of them just blocks from the White House, George Washington University, GW University, the statue of George Washington, as you can see, defamed there, vandalized there.
So overall, I've been impressed by the anti-Israel, pro-Palestine crowd for the discipline that they have generally showed. For example, in overwhelmingly, they're refusing to talk to the news media. And I think that's in their side's interest, because most people on any side of a debate are not very smart. And so the pro-Palestine crowd has been very strategic in only having a small number of spokespeople, and everyone else keeps their mouth shut. On the other hand, all the footage of them denying access to basic campus facilities to Jewish students, right, is just not going to play well. And so like the Black Lives Matter riots in 2020, these riots, I think, will play to the advantage of Republicans.
The Palestinian flag and that getup as the president was speaking, and David Spunt telling us that it's essentially that same way as of this hour. Let's bring in our panel. Guy Benson, political editor at townhall.com, host of The Guy Benson Show on Fox News Radio, syndicated radio host Hugh Hewitt, and USA Today White House correspondent Francesca Chambers. Hugh, what about the president's message? Obviously, the time.
One of the hilarious tropes in the mainstream news media coverage is that it's really important for Joe Biden to make peace and to assuage the left-wing component of the Democratic Party. So the left-wing part of the Democratic Party, like the right-wing part of the Republican Party, is where the enthusiasm is, but the votes for both parties come from the center. And so in a poll of the concerns of young Americans, right, the Arab-Israeli conflict ranked 15th out of 16. So these university anti-Israel, pro-Palestine protests throughout the United States, right, don't reflect the concerns of ordinary young people in this country. They don't even reflect the concerns of most university students.
Timing is coming into criticism, but what about what he said and how he said it?
I was not impressed. I listened to 4.5 minutes, took him 2.5 minutes, actually 2 minutes and 40 seconds to bring up anti-Semitism. He talked primarily about violence instead of the messages accompanying the violence, such as intifada, hung out.
So Jewish students have had their life rendered more awkward, and for those who are predisposed to fear and anxiety, all right, their fear and anxiety would likely have skyrocketed during these protests, as it would for many Muslims, all right? There was a particularly fierce Jewish counter-protest at U.C.L.A. But overall, like compared to the problems that Jews have faced in the past, all right, I'm not even familiar with one Jewish student being beaten up, all right, since October 7th. I'm not familiar with one Jewish student on an American college campus being severely beaten by the pro-Palestine crowd. So I think much of the hype about anti-Semitism on college campuses is somewhat overstated. Yeah, I'm sure it feels awkward. I'm sure it's uncomfortable. And overwhelmingly, this is playing to the advantage of Jews and Israel, because most ordinary people who don't have a stake in this fight, they see video footage of these protests, and to the extent that they're going to take a side, I don't think most of them will side particularly intensely with the Palestinians.
Out of Hamilton Hall, which is a recollection of the 2000 to 2003, 140 suicide bombings in Israel. I think the president needs to be very specific that anti-Semitism in the United States is the problem. He also mentioned Islamophobia, more generally hate speech.
So I don't think anti-Semitism in the United States is the problem, except for a tiny proportion of the black community. Right? There's a tiny proportion of the black community that is frequently violent and vicious against Jews. Aside from that, anti-Semitism is not a major problem in the United States.
Those are terrible. Those are not the problem. The problem is anti-Semitism.
The White House has said they had this anti-Semitism commission basically set up months ago, and that they met or they talked about this.
You know what would do good for anti-Semitism, right? And for the quality of life in America? Take down the super predators and put them in prison for a long time, right? The type of people who launch violent attacks against Jews, right? Very similar to the type of people who launch violent attacks against blacks and Latinos and Asians and white people, right? Take the super predators, take the people who are committing violent crimes and put them away in prison for a very long time, right? Take the most disruptive people in public spaces, take the most disruptive people on public transport and put them in prison for a long time. You will dramatically improve the quality of life in the United States.
This week, yet they didn't really detail that and haven't talked about that much. What about this leaving most of it to the White House press secretary and paper statements until today? Francesca, has the White House kind of dealt with that?
They have primarily left it, as you noted, to paper statements, and they have also sent out other members of the administration to talk.
I mean, just totally stupid, inane talking point, all right? Just lock up the super predators against any group in America, right? Lock up the people who are committing violent crime, right? That is 100 times more important than these anti-Semitism task forces.
Talk with people about this, including the second gentleman. Doug Emhoff has held listening sessions on this as well, and I'm told that the vice president has held listening sessions behind closed doors on from all kinds of people.
We don't need listening sessions about anti-Semitism. We just need to lock up the super predators for a long time.
On these issues. Largely, though, a lot of this has been happening behind closed doors, and that's what Biden has come under criticism for, finally speaking out about this today after coming under immense political pressure to say something about this at all.
Okay.
It's a better late than never situation. The last time he took a stab at it with his own voice, of course, was the both sidesism response that was awful that he gave. What was
on
that,
Earth Day,
a week or so
April
ago?
22nd.
Yes. With AOC, they held hands, and maybe she rubbed off on him a little bit there. But I think the image that we put up of General Washington, President Washington, draped in Palestinian garb with all the signs and the hate messages around it, I think that turns the stomach of most Americans, not just conservatives, not just Jews, most Americans. We saw recently at Yale, an American flag was torn down from a war memorial by this mob as they cheered.
Yeah, so the pro-Israel crowd has been much more strategic in wrapping themselves in the American flag, while the anti-Israel crowd has displayed its colors with the contempt that they have for America. And overwhelmingly, when I look at these protests, right, from the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel crowd, it does not look like the best and the brightest from university campuses. Instead, it looks to be overwhelmingly those who benefit from affirmative action, fearing the accountability of showing up for tests. And they got affirmative action into university, but affirmative action may not be enough to help them graduate from university. So instead, they want to offload their anxiety by causing a ruckus.
We're seeing some of the demands, or the so-called demands, from some of these encampments that involve carbon emissions and defunding the police. A lot of this is rooted in Jew hatred, which is stomach-turning, but there's something deeper here. This is an unholy alliance of communists and Islamists, and most significantly anti-American, anti-civilization forces. And I think it's important to recognize exactly what we're seeing.
What about the politics of this moment? You know, you heard the president there, Hugh, saying this isn't a time for politics, but politics factors into everything when you get in Washington.
Okay, among the stupidest public statements that we hear from politicians is this isn't a time for politics, right? Absolutely absurd. These are political protests. It's intensely political.
Where is this?
I think the only explanation for the Biden policy about Israel is to try and prevent an invasion of Rafah so as not to destroy his political election campaigns even more than they have been destroyed. He has a 70% plus negative rating on handling the Israel situation. He does not want to do anything to upset the vote in Michigan.
It's crazy. In my community, pro-Israel community, it's overwhelmingly they're convinced that if it was not for American interference that Israel could get things done. Right? Israel has pretty much done what it's wanted with regard to the Palestinians for at least 30 years. And Israel has pretty much done what it has wanted with Hamas and with Hezbollah. And soon, I believe we're going to see an Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon as they take on and possibly take out Hamas. So this idea that the Biden administration is just tying Israeli hands behind their back in this fight against Hamas is ludicrous. All right. The Israel situation, handling the Israel-Hamas situation, it can't be handled. Right? America can't handle this situation. Right? It is two groups who hate each other intensely in the same locale, and this war is going to go on until one side is destroyed.
In the Arab American vote, and the only explanation for an incoherent policy, and when it's not silence, it's incoherence, is that it's all about the politics of the president. It's a terrible way to lead the country.
You know, there's a lot of focus, obviously, on the House Republicans and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all of that rift. But the Democrats, Francesca, this is semaphores. Democrats are stuck in a familiar place, arguing over Israel. The protesters at Columbia demonstrated that there are two factions of the protesters. There's the pro-Hamas, then there's the really pro-Hamas. That's Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman, Democrat, telling Semaphore. In the House, Representative Jamal Bowman delivered an impassioned speech backing the protests at Columbia University, in which he accused police of inflicting brutality on student demonstrators. So there is a real split in the Democratic Party that's pretty visible.
There is a very real split between the Democratic Party on whether or not Biden and the Biden administration should continue sending weapons to Israel and its war. I mean, you saw when there was the vote in the House of Representatives that there were.
And again, this is like a major news story that many of my pro-Israel friends are all up in arms and concerned about. There's no question that the United States is going to arm Israel. Why? Because foreign policy, including the arming of Israel, is conducted by a very tiny number of people, right? And the college protesters have absolutely nothing to do with it. There's just no question the United States will continue to arm to subsidize Israel. And if push comes to the shove, the United States, for all its trepidations and complaints about Bibi Netanyahu, will come to Israel's defense if there is some kind of major conflagration in the Middle East and, you know, Hezbollah and Iran start raining down rockets on Israel. All right, the United States of America, the strongest military in the world, will come to bat for Israel. There's no discussion. There's no serious possibility of the U.S. stopping arming Israel right now. It's not even a chance.
Were more than a dozen House Democrats who voted against the Israel aid portion of the bill because they support defensive weapons, but they do not support offensive weapons. And he's heard from this from progressives. I mean, you look at Michigan, where the abandoned Biden movement got more than 100,000 votes, and some of these other states. He is facing an issue in the Democratic Party that could hurt him in the general election.
Yeah. 2020 tweet from Joe Biden blaming then President Trump for violence in the United States, August 27, 2020. Remember, he wrote, every example of violence Donald Trump decries has happened on his watch, under his leadership, during his presidency.
Law enforcement is something in the United States that is overwhelmingly conducted by local police departments and sheriff's departments. Right? The president of the United States can possibly use a bully pulpit and can produce incentives to enforce the law or to not enforce the law, but overwhelmingly law enforcement is a local issue. It's not a presidential one.
So you've heard this on other channels looking at this saying this is a moment.
It's a moment that he's had an opportunity to show leadership on, and for, I think, the reasons that Hugh laid out, he's unwilling to really fully commit one way or the other. And the balancing act isn't impressing anyone. He's not winning over anyone with this. Pro-Israel people are aghast by the equivocation. People who call him Genocide Joe are not going to be persuaded by any of this. And I think some of the conventional wisdom in this town and at the White House and in the campaign is wrong. The new CNN poll that has him deep, deep, deep underwater on the Israel issue, yes, he's struggling badly among young people. He's struggling worse among independents. Normie Americans are disgusted by this, and he really isn't speaking to them. He changed that a little bit today, but not terribly well.
All right, we will see.
Than every previous president in history. I believe doing what's always worked best for this country.
All right, President.
Yeah, so the more Joe Biden talks, I think the fewer votes he gets. Probably the same for Donald Trump.
Biden in North Carolina, former President Trump outside the courtroom in his criminal trial. The Fox Battleground polls, three-way race. You heard RFK Jr. mentioned. It does affect several races, and you see Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin there. If you ask the question about the economy, who do you trust on the economy? Former President Trump overwhelming in those 4 states, and that.
So yeah, right now Donald Trump seems to be situated fairly nicely. Okay, so that conversation about managing the Israel-Hamas conflict is absurd, and the beautiful and wise Heidi Priebe, a YouTube attachment expert, she talks about this very delusion, right? This character flaw of overtaking responsibility, right? For the United States to think that it can run the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Ukraine-Russia conflict is just a classic case of overtaking responsibility, right? Not taking enough responsibility, right? Obviously a character defect, but taking too much responsibility, major character defect here.
Healthy sense of self-esteem, a big part of it is having a realistic self-assessment, not solely a positive one, which means staying aware of where we lack power, just as much as we are aware of where we have it and where we could take it. So when we have too much self-responsibility, what we are doing is trying to turn everything in our lives into a problem that we alone have the power to solve. And generally, we're doing this for one of 2 reasons.
America does not have the ability to solve the Ukraine issue nor the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? And so for America to be so deeply involved in conflicts that have very little to do with America's vital national security interests is insane. And this applies also for individuals.
First reason is that we might have this idea in our heads that the opposite of self-responsibility is blame. So if I were to stop taking control of all of my problems, I might think the only other option is to try to force someone else to care about and take responsibility for solving my problems. And the reason I might look at those 2 things as the only options that are available is because I might have a giant blind spot around my own fear of sitting with uncertainty. So I might not even be able to conceptualize the idea that I could just leave a problem unsolved for a little bit if it doesn't really make sense for me to take complete control of the situation. When we are desperate to solve every problem that arises for us in life very quickly and by whatever means necessary, often we are doing that because we are trying to bypass the pain of being present with the problem and all of the feelings that it's bringing up for us. So we're trying to dominate our experience and gain control over it rather than attune to it and stay present with it. And we're usually doing this because we lack the skill to effectively navigate uncertainty and victimhood. But uncertainty and victimhood are absolutely natural parts of life just as much as control and action are. And if we are trying to eliminate those things from our awareness, what we are doing is cutting ourselves off from the experience of reality as it actually exists. And this is an inherently dysregulating thing for us to do.
Right, so I'm thinking about a friend who opens up his heart, opens up his home to some disreputable characters. I only pray to God he doesn't also open up other parts of himself. All right, so empathy is a beautiful quality, but you can take it too far, right? Responsibility, beautiful quality. You can take it too far. Josh Randall says, she's way into me. Her eyes like a couple of Icelandic ponds. I want to give her all my money. Bro, you should see my new ADHD doctor. She is, I believe, of Scandinavian, Swedish heritage, just stunning blonde. And prior to that, I had an ADHD nurse or specialist who was about 250 pounds north of that, African American, not lovely lady, but was not a source of temptation for me. And I didn't really check in with her a great deal, but now I want to check in with my new ADHD medicator like all the time. I mean, stunning, professional, cool, calm, collected, empathic, just, oh, she's fantastic. All right, Jonathan Chait, writing for New York's Intelligencer column. The House anti-Semitism bill is bad for Jews. He says the problem of campus anti-Israel activism creating an atmosphere of anti-Semitism is real, but the solution of regulating anti-Zionism as hate speech is absurd. That's right. Why should not college allow students or faculty call for the destruction or elimination of various nation states, including Israel? Right? Now, yeah, destroying or eliminating Israel is a ghastly idea from my perspective, right? It would require Hitlerian scale violence, writes Jonathan Chait. But colleges are supposed to allow people to advocate bad ideas, right? Just equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, right? Plenty of people don't believe the Kurds should have their own nation state, but should that kind of speech be prohibited? Right? You can disagree with Zionism without being anti-Semitic, right? Not every group enjoys self-determination. Is it bigotry to oppose statehood for Kurds or Tibetans? Right? You can imagine that the Jewish population of Israel will somehow survive and prosper in a world in which their state has survived, but in all likelihood, this would require the death of millions of people. So in reality, right, in theory, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism are two distinct categories. In practice, anti-Zionism tends to place intense pressure on Jews to abandon their national identity and their communal traditions. They want to be accepted into the wider communities. So all sorts of progressive activist spaces on university college campuses, required people to renounce Israel as a price of admission to the groups and to be able to move freely on campus, right? And Jews disproportionately believe in Israel's existence, and so this informal requirement amounts to de facto discrimination against Jews. And you see this popping up again and again and again, where Jews were simply denied access to ordinary campus facilities such as libraries.
A whole and integrated person means to live with the awareness that we exist in a complex ecosystem of relationships and events and cultures that impact us in a way that we don't have full control over. And if we're really committed to staying grounded in reality, we have to have the humility to stay aware of that, rather than looking at absolutely everything in our lives as a problem that needs to be immediately solved. But we're going to get more into that in the latter half of this video, when we're going to talk about how to get into healthier relationship with self-responsibility. The second reason we might choose to become over-responsible in our lives is because we're telling ourselves the story that we are protecting either another person or our relationship with that person by taking on complete responsibility for everything.
So there was a lot of footage of Jewish students being denied access to university campuses. So this Jewish Iranian American born in Iran, Sia Kordestani, has a compelling Twitter
Depends on
profile.
whether you care what happens to the Palestinians as opposed to the Hamas government and the people with guided missiles. Yes, they were. Yes, they were. No, wait a minute. Yes, they were. And Hamas is really smart. When they decide to rocket Israel, they insinuate themselves in the hospitals, in the schools, in the highly populous areas, and they are smart. So they try. So they wait. So they try to put the Israelis in a position of either not defending themselves or killing innocents. They're good at it. They're smart. They've been doing this a long time. Look, I don't agree. I killed myself to give the Palestinians a state. I had a deal they turned down that would have given them all of Gaza, all of Gaza, between 96 and 97% of the West Bank, compensating land in Israel, you name it.
Okay, here's more from Sia Kordestani's Twitter feed. History will look down shamefully on the cowards and terrorist sympathizers who failed to stand up against anti-Semitism at UCLA. Only one elected official stood up unapologetically for the safety of Jewish students. Now, I'm unaware of any Jewish students being severely beaten. But here we got Michael Powell writing in The Atlantic. I was struck after 2 days of Columbia. I understand my opponent's suffering, how that had become part of the pro-Palestinian talk. And as a response, if Michael Powell was in Germany during Kristallnacht, he'd have lamented how the Nazi mobs and the Jewish community had failed to understand my opponent's suffering. Peaceful protest is a protected right, chanting, burn Tel Aviv to the ground, and breaking into university buildings is not.
What I don't understand is this should be a layup. This should be easy. It should be easy to say we support people who want to protest. It's their First Amendment right. We support people who want to fight for the rights of Palestinians. We support the people who want to fight against the war. Those are all protected by the First Amendment. But as soon as it goes into anti-Semitism, of go back to Poland or bomb Tel Aviv or kill all the Zionists, right? People should be saying, hold on, that's not us. We don't want to be with that. That's not our movement. In fact, you're not helping Palestinians when you say that. This should be a layup. They should be able to come out and say this. But no, they apparently can't do it. It's a step, a bridge too far, apparently. I don't understand.
Okay, rough day for Israel haters. First, the UCLA encampment was cleared out. Now, multiple left-leaning media figures, including Al Sharpton, have compared anti-Israel campus radicals to the January 6 attackers. Then Joe Biden puts the cherry on the top. You know what's as outrageous as anti-Israel radicals destroying the iconic Royce Hall at UCLA?
Politics to that, what is being worried about them not doing that, Joe, where you and I agree. How do the Democrats, how do all of us on that side say January 6th was wrong if you can have the same pictures going on college campuses?
Good Lord, don't make a parallel with January 6th.
You lose the moral high ground.
That has happened, though.
Okay,
that has happened.
So we know what's going on here, just the latest from the AP, and then we're going to go live to the scene.
Thank you. A student who was kicked in the head and knocked unconscious during the protests at UCLA is recovering at home after being rushed to the hospital. Our Kathy Vara talked to her and her family in an interview you will see for the first time and only on 4. Kathy?
Colleen, Eleanor, who asked us not to use her last name, says this was a very traumatic incident for her, and she replays it in her mind every time she closes her eyes.
The first night was beyond difficult to go to sleep. I could just repeatedly imagine, and I can see myself hitting the ground, and it's so terrifying.
Eleanor, a psychology major at Pierce College in Woodland Hills, went to the protest at UCLA Sunday with her family.
We went there to protest, to stand, and to be there for our country, for Israel.
But things turned ugly when her sister dropped her Israeli flag.
I'm going down to get it. It's being kicked and stepped on, and then I'm being kicked and stepped on.
The protests were reaching a boiling point, and Eleanor was suddenly caught in the middle.
I ran down to try to pull her out of their feet, and they pushed her back, and her head slammed the ground. And for a minute, I thought that's it. I lost her.
This incident, one of many that have occurred since the protest started last week, with dozens of tents popping up on the main campus lawn at UCLA. Then, over the next few days, the encampment expanded. Protesters started to become more vocal, pushing and shoving happening between both sides. On Sunday, the day Eleanor was injured, the LAPD issues a citywide tactical alert, and things continue to get out of hand. Just before 11 p.m. yesterday, counter-demonstrators, many wearing black clothes and white masks.
Look, if you're at a violent place, don't go down. Right? Don't get down on your knees. Right? Rescuing a flag is not worth it if it places you in a particularly vulnerable position. And maybe women should not be attending violent protests, right? I think what happened to this woman is horrible, but women, children, those who are physically vulnerable should not be attending violent protests.
Tear down pro-Palestinian barricades. Protesters on both sides say they are sprayed with some sort of irritant, maybe pepper spray. At midnight, fireworks are set off by one or both sides. And by 3 in the morning, the area is cleared, peace restored. Eleanor is shaken, but is recovering, and her mother says what happened to her daughter during the protests at UCLA is not going to stop the family from rallying for Israel in a peaceful way.
If you allow the fear, so, the evil will win. And that's not, no.
So given the intensity of the feeling and that there are about 1,000 people on each side of the Sunday protest, I'm amazed at the low level of injuries.
That's not going to happen. We have to stand for our voice proudly.
Eleanor underwent tests at the hospital, including a CT scan. She is now at home, recovering physically and mentally from her ordeal.
Like, why expose yourself to that kind of danger? You're not going to make a big difference in the world showing up to some violent protest, right? You're just putting your own well-being at risk. Yeah, so another characteristic of these anti-Israel crowds is that they trash places, right? They don't seem to build things. They just destroy things. Whoops. So we've got someone saying, I once thought Juliet Kayyem was credible and no longer do. She's calling protests peaceful even when radicals vandalize iconic buildings. Yeah, look, a lot of arguments in the media say that the pro-Palestine protests are peaceful if they're not actively going out and beating people down. But if you deny access to people, for example, when I went to the pro-Israel rally, a large crowd of Palestinians formed to deny us even access to the pro-Israel rally. That is inciting violence, right? When you stop the ability of people to congregate, to get an education, to use the educational facilities such as a library, that their education costs, in total $50,000 to $100,000 a year, right? That doesn't mean the student necessarily pays all that, but the state does. And these protests make it more difficult for the overwhelming majority of students to get an education. Right, scrolling through this Twitter feed, right? Sign held by the demonstrator in this photo calls for the violent destruction of the state of Israel. Israel, U.S. are allies. Right, I was at the UCLA pro-Israel rally. Early on, pro-Palestinian individuals formed a human chain. Yeah, I saw this, to block Jews from entering the area in front of the stage where we had a permitted peaceful rally. Most of us just went another way. But this was another attempt to stop us from exercising our rights. Yeah, I saw that and I captured that on video. And many Jewish students were simply prevented from going to class, going to library, walking across the campus. So finally, after allowing the protests to go on for days, they finally shut them down.
University! Where is your humanity? Where is your humanity? Silence is complicity! Silence is complicity! Profit is complicity! Israel must fall! Israel must fall! We are prisoners, free them all! We are prisoners, free them all! Israel must fall! Israel must fall! What do we want? Justice! What do we want now? They're killing sons, they're killing daughters! They're killing sons, they're killing daughters! Gaza must have food and water! 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 Gaza!
Okay, future surgeons, attorneys, dentists. An official on UCLA campus sent me these photos and video, told me the university is using taxpayer money to violate law. Official security is maintaining a perimeter around the anti-Israel encampment while they're keeping some students out, right, such as Jewish students. They allow others in. So you see one student blocked from entering Royce Quad. Students wearing keffiyehs are allowed to use the steps. Right, this is official security, not encampment members. Right, so wristbands are being used to identify anti-Israel students at UCLA. they are allowed to use the Royce Quad, the Royce Hall, and the Powell Library, right? So some students are allowed in, Jews, Zionists are allowed out.
What if I know someone? And they're in here?
Yeah, I'm trying to go to class, man.
Politically uninvolved students blocked from going to class by mass anti-Israel demonstrators. Right, on a public campus. Right, this isn't really going to play well.
You have to go around.
Right, this is functionally anti-Semitism.
Yeah, yeah, no.
Because the thing is, even if once you exit the encampment, there's security there, they won't let you go further. It's not just us that have blocked things off.
I'd rather hear that from security.
You can go ask them.
You can go take that bridge, you take another one, you can go ask them up there. I mean, that's not the point.
You can't get out basically from the other side, so.
I don't need to get out. My class is up there on the quad.
Not even a political.
So why would Jews not form counter-protests to violently attack those who are making their life much more difficult? So I understand the intensity of the Jewish counter-protests, right? So this is Jonathan Chait writing, this is effectively anti-Semitism, right? They may not be preventing Jews per se from accessing these areas, but they've created a litmus test that only people who are anti-Israel are allowed to pass, right? Only people who are anti-Israel allowed to use the quad, use the Powell Library, right? They're going to deter many Jewish students and other Zionists. So UCLA gave radical students autonomous control of significant portions of the campus. And not surprisingly, this quickly spiraled into anarchy. And then pro-Israel counter-demonstrators unleashed, violence in response, which completely makes sense to me. Why would you just acquiesce to what's going on from these anti-Israel encampments? So these unauthorized encampments, of course, Congress leap to some kind of legislative response, but a pretty stupid one, says Jonathan Chait. Yeah, he has some pretty sharp commentary. Why the right loves the anti-Israel encampments. Yeah, it rallies the right because they already despise universities and the left. And they despise the anti-white animus that is behind much of this anti-Israel protest. So we shouldn't take too much responsibility, right? Overtaking or undertaking responsibility, not a good idea.
Everything that happens within that relationship. And generally when we do this, what we're not being aware of is the fact that we are probably pretty uncomfortable or even kind of terrified of dealing with the feelings that would come up inside of ourselves if we stopped overtaking responsibility inside of our relationships. Because what if the other person can't give us what we need? What if the other person doesn't want to stay in relationship with us if we're not staying responsible for everything that happens? What if they don't have the interpersonal skill levels required to stay in relationship with us? So what we're usually doing when we're overtaking responsibility in relationships is we're trying to avoid a relational threat and all of the feelings of pain and grief that would come alongside it. And again, we're going to go much deeper into that in the latter half of this video, where we're going to talk about what some of the specific things you might be avoiding inside of your relationships are. Now, in reality, both of these assumptions are absolutely fundamentally untrue. It is fundamentally untrue that our only options when it comes to tackling a problem are take complete responsibility or...
So good essay in Politico. Don't forget the backlash to the 1960s. Today's campus chaos carries a grim warning for Joe Biden and the Democrats, right? Chaos, protests, right? Disruption, right? That works against the party in power. Protests of any kind produce a sense of unease among the public, right? They trigger a backlash. And remember, this got Richard Nixon elected in 1968. Donald Trump, purely on his own qualities, would never be elected president of the United States. Only during times of extraordinary crisis does Donald Trump have any chance to become president of the United States. Ronald Reagan centered his 1966 campaign for governor of California on attacking college protests, such as the free speech movement at the University of California at Berkeley. Right? Reagan blamed university administrators who were just too soft on the radicals. right? Alabama Governor George Wallace, right, also fought against college protesters and achieved considerable support. Right, this cost the Democrats the 1968 election. A professor of semantics in 1968, S.I. Hayakawa, became the interim president of San Francisco State University, which was a campus beset by protests and strikes. He took efforts to crack down on this illegal behavior. He became a folk hero. In 1976, he won a seat in the U.S. Senate as a Republican. Right, so chaos works very much against Joe Biden and the Democrats. And the more unstable, the more ill at ease people feel, all right, the more likely they are to vote for Donald Trump.
Or blame someone else and hope that they will take complete responsibility. It is also fundamentally untrue that we are helping other people or keeping our relationships healthy by taking complete control of them. When we take too much responsibility, we lose our connection to reality, and we obscure other people's connection.
Right, not enough water, not a good thing. Too much water, not a good thing. Not enough exercise, bad thing. Too much exercise, bad thing. All right, am I Jewish? Yes, I'm wearing a yarmulke. I'm a convert to Judaism. You seem to be a fan of Richard Spencer. Not a fan of Richard Spencer. He's someone who is easy to understand, right? It's pretty easy to keep an eye on Richard and to understand, you know, what's driving him. All right.
Oh my goodness. Campus Day of Rage shocks the nation. Biden's got a problem.
DEI, it's not all, roses. It's gone too far to become a religion.
Happy DEI Thursday, Lemon.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Not everyone in Hollywood lives behind guard gates. We didn't feel safe anymore, and that was the biggest reason that we moved.
Los Angeles no longer safe for models and actresses. Candace Cameron Bure joins Primetime.
My Lanta?
Plus,
what do you think about him?
Who was that?
His last name is Kennedy.
Is he like dead?
Fox News alert. A night of anarchy on the West Coast after Antifa got their hands on more weapons than Zelensky. The West Coast Martyrs Brigade stormed UCLA's campus last night, strapped with helmets, gas masks, and riot gear. Not your typical, mostly peaceful protesters. Weapons of choice?
So UCLA had the most vigorous counter-protesters of all America's campuses, whereas UCLA, because LA has the second biggest population of Jews of any major American city.
Included fire extinguishers, bottles, 2x4s, and umbrellas. Clashes with the police went on until the crack of dawn. Over 200 arrests made overnight. Cops snatching their masks off like Scooby-Doo villains. Wait, that's not a college student. That's a 40-year-old woman. Other protesters cuffed and frog-marched, grinning ear to ear. Their parents must be so proud. At Portland State University, anarchists also laid siege to a library that was, let's be honest, already empty. Police reports that the only books they stole were comic books. But then they retreated from the library when the cops arrived. Watch.
Yeah. I got it right now. Hey, cops are doing their job. Cops are doing their job.
Making a shield from a Rubbermaid trash can like a homeless middle schooler playing Dungeons and Dragons? Oscar the Groucho Marx? Never played football because he bounced off that cop like a bowling pin. Running towards police in a bankruptcy barrel, not the brightest escape tactic. Police don't know what to expect. Is that Hacksaw Jim Duggan or Mary Poppins? Body cam footage just released the moment the NYPD busted up Colombia's Liberation Zone.
Okay, good article in The Atlantic by David Graham. Biden's patience with campus protests runs out. Chaos in the streets is never to an incumbent's advantage. The vortex of campus politics has threatened to suck Joe Biden in. Protesters have dubbed him Genocide Joe, demanded that he act to stop Israel's actions. Joe Biden couldn't stop Israel's actions in Gaza, even if he wanted to. All right, so Democrats are increasingly nervous about the political ramifications of the protests of the upcoming elections. White House has tried to stay out of it until today. Right, the president has seemed sympathetic to the protesters, but today his patience ran out, and he's accepting the conservative framing of the protest as fundamentally a problem of discipline. So now Joe Biden's advocating for more law and order. Right, he's not willing to take responsibility for the sweeps by police. Right, he's not exactly pro-police, but he's probably the least anti-police of the major Democrats.
Entire life to being Republicans. If you're offended by this, please, I'm trying to help you. I don't want Donald Trump to get elected, all right?
There you go.
Trying to help you. If you're too stupid to figure that out, you change to another channel.
Biden got the message.
Oh, that's good. I want to see this.
Music to my ears. Good thing Biden's hard of hearing. But this morning, he had Morning Joe cranked up to a 10.
How do the Democrats, how do all of us on that side say January 6th was wrong if you can have the same pictures going on college campuses?
Good Lord, don't make a parallel with January 6th.
The riots on college campuses, the riots at the Chicago Convention in '68, all of those things moved my family from being Democrats their entire life to being Republicans. If you're offended by this, please, I'm trying to help you. I don't want Donald Trump to get elected, all right?
There you go.
Trying to help you. If you're too stupid to figure that out, you change to another channel.
Biden got the message. His favorite TV shows telling him he's going to lose in a landslide to a law and order candidate like Nixon because of campus chaos. And history has a way of repeating itself. After 10 days of silence, to save his presidency.
Okay, more from Jonathan Chait. Joe Biden is losing the election in the center, right? Not the left, right? The voters he needs aren't occupying college campuses. So you have a lot of national pundits who are saying that Joe Biden's poor standing in the presidential election was the result of his left wing over his policy on Gaza. And Michigan was supposedly the epicenter of this crisis with its large Arab American population, right? But the evidence shows that Michigan is the best Joe Biden swing state, or his least bad one, right? He's trailing by a much larger margin in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Sunbelt states. Right, so Joe Biden does not really have a specific Michigan problem. Right, the causes of Joe Biden's lagging campaign are banal. The inflation run-up of 2021 to 2022, that tanked his approval ratings, but that's not even the story. Joe Biden has never been a particularly popular politician. He's never been popular. So there's nothing surprising that he remains unpopular. Right, his age demeanor makes it harder for people to believe that he is effective or competent. Right, the Trump presidency keeps looking better and better in retrospect. Biden is disproportionately shedding non-white Democrats to Trump, but he's mainly losing the center. Right, the voters who switch from Biden in 2020 to Trump now, more than half identify as moderate, 1/3 as conservative, only 14% as liberal. So the phenomenon of far-left voters looking to punish Biden exists, but its numerical scale is tiny. What about the angry youth? Right? Harvard Youth Poll asked voters 18 to 29 to rank the 16 issues in most importance. Israel-Palestine conflict ranked 15th. Issues at the top of the list: inflation, number 1, healthcare, housing, right? Same meat and potato issues that concern other voters. So why do we have this narrative of disillusioned young lefties? Right? Because the progressive movement has many groups whose entire mission is to push the Democratic Party leftward by threatening to energize the base and say the base won't be energized unless various policy demands are left. So all the enthusiasm for the Democrats, right, the passion, the door knockers come from the left, the votes come from closer to the center. And the media treat these left-wing claims as juicy drama. They treat these claims at face value. There's almost nothing you should treat at face value if there's any chance, right, when it comes to public events, that they should not be treated at face value. Right, voters have low tolerance for giving up anything significant to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Right, phasing out gasoline cars is unpopular by 20 points. Only 1/4 of Americans say they're willing to pay higher taxes to stop climate change. Campus protests have captured an enormous amount of public attention. They're dominating news coverage, but they don't have much significance. Yeah, they're having an effect on the race. They're elevating the salience of the conflict between Gaza and Israel, which splits Joe Biden's base and unites Donald Trump's base at the expense of issues that unite Biden's base and split Trump's, all right? If we were primarily talking about abortion, right, the Republicans would be headed in a losing direction. But given that we're primarily talking about campus protests, that unites Donald Trump's base, divides Joe Biden's base, right? The people that Joe Biden most needs to win, all right, are in the center. They're not a bunch of lefties.
Protesters. A terrorist state wants to sponsor these little Johnny Jihads who swear allegiance to Hamas on the Quad. Why isn't the FBI and media unmasking these traitors? A woman's life got turned upside down and inside out because she opened up a hair salon during the pandemic just to feed her family. No one's even a little curious about this radical crew. There's a terror nexus staring us right in the face. Bill Ayers, former Weather Underground, former domestic terrorist. The guy's group bombed the Pentagon. He's out there inspiring the University of Chicago Brigade with stories of revolutions past. And he's a professor at the school there. No wonder it's out of control. Stanford University called in the FBI when a man wearing a Hamas headband was spotted on campus. Nick Sandman wore a MAGA hat, and the media wrote 100,000 words about him. This guy with a Hamas headband flies right under the radar. During the George Floyd riots.
So, like the alt-right, these pro-Palestine, anti-Israel protesters are overwhelmingly trying to stay anonymous, but it reduces the effectiveness of their message. Good article in the New York Times. Before the violence, UCLA thought a tolerant approach would work. Right? Tolerating disorder and anarchy and active discrimination against people based on their viewpoint is not a winning approach. UCLA was ill-prepared when protesters blocked students from accessing parts of campus. Counter-protesters violently attacked the pro-Palestinian encampment. Why would they not? So UCLA was supposedly an example of a tolerant campus, right, where a burgeoning pro-Palestinian encampment might be left alone and free speech would be celebrated, right? But how are you going to celebrate free speech when many students can't even use normal college facilities? And UC campuses, all right, they don't like the police, right? UC campuses have very remote relations with police, right? Normal UC campus, all right, the school, UCLA, abides by a University of California policy that avoids involving law enforcement unless, quote, absolutely necessary to protect the physical safety of our campus community. All right, if you don't take these protests down in the early stages, they just get worse and worse and worse. So waiting to use law enforcement until absolutely necessary just means that antisocial, criminally inclined people are going to create terror, and law-abiding citizens are going to operate at a significant disadvantage.
4 years later, they have the same expectations. Biden can say don't all he wants. Our enemies won't listen to him. Why would our citizens? You can smack an old lady's head off and walk out with no bail. No one's worried about going to jail for a protest. You think the foreign exchange students hoisting the Palestinian flag are worried about being deported? Biden hasn't deported anybody. They see a justice system focused on prosecuting Republicans, not them. They're not stopping at Free Palestine either. This movement's morphed into a grab bag of your typical anti-American activism.
We demand that U.Chicago repair the harm it has caused in Palestine, Chicago, and beyond. This includes explicitly acknowledging such harm, as well as implementing a communally accountable program of reparation.
So yeah, there is a lawless element to MAGA, but overall, MAGA supporters, Donald Trump supporters commit, far fewer crimes than Biden voters, right? The people who are committing the most mayhem in America, the most violent crime, right, are not Republican voters. So Donald Trump has long been described by his supporters as an outlaw hero, as a Robin Hood, right? Someone who's taking on the system. But overwhelmingly, the Republicans are pro-law enforcement. Right, they're overwhelmingly pro-punishing criminals. I think January 6th was absolutely horrific, but Donald Trump's outlaw appeal rests in that he's willing to go up against our dominant institutions that are overwhelmingly controlled by the left. So that's why when Donald Trump says, I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those who've been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution, right, that resonates. Right, that's significant to people.
They see a justice system focused on prosecuting Republicans, not them. They're not stopping at Free Palestine either. This movement's morphed into a grab bag of your typical anti-American activism.
We demand that U.Chicago repair the harm it has caused in Palestine, Chicago, and beyond. This includes explicitly acknowledging such harm, as well as implementing a communally accountable program of reparation, disbanding UCPD, decarbonizing the endowment, and reducing emissions by 50% by 2030.
Reparations, defund the police, global warming, what does that have to do with Gaza? And how does divesting from Israel help Palestinians? It doesn't. These protests aren't helping anyone. The protesters aren't even helping themselves. No one's going to hire these psychos after their identities break. They've lost the plot.
Anytime what you are protesting for becomes secondary to what you are doing, then you're really not protesting for it. And you, in many ways, dramatize what we did in Vieques, what I did later in other situations, was to bring attention to a cause, not become the cause. Right. And what is troubling me about a lot of this is they become the cause. It's about them. It is not about pushing the cause. They've lost the message.
Everybody wants to fight the power in college. It's a rite of passage. But what's to fight? Life's too good in America. But they still want to suffer for their cause. So they're...
Okay, looking at the Los Angeles Times, got an article here. LGBTQ plus people in Huntington Beach fearful of what they say is a rise in hostility. So Huntington Beach, Manhattan Beach, these are these rare communities in Southern California that are conservative. I just don't recall many articles about people who believe in a traditional conception of marriage being between one man and one woman. Why would they not fear a rise in hostility? So what the LA Times calls a rise in hostility towards LGBTQ plus people is in all likelihood primarily a rise in opposition to gay marriage, an opposition to the gay agenda, to people who just want to stick with a traditional conception of marriage and of morality and of a hero system. So if you support a traditional conception of marriage, of course you're going to have hostility towards groups that want to radically change sexual mores. Right? It's incredibly destabilizing once you start pulling at the thread of the traditional family.
Their idea of a struggle is losing their meal plan because they're living in a tent. They want the cops to hurt them a little. It's the only time they'll ever feel real pain, makes them feel alive. They're raging against a machine that dropped the SATs, paid off their loans, and hired them just for their identity. Isn't that what they wanted? Francis Fukuyama warned in The End of History that if men cannot struggle on behalf of a just cause, then they struggle for the sake of struggle, out of boredom, for they cannot imagine living in a world without struggle. And there's plenty of people willing to finance the struggle. PBD flagged the financial reason why the Ivies have gone so soft on Arab Spring break. They get half their money from donations and gifts. And a lot of that money pours in from the Mideast. We saw how Chinese money can massage a university's posture. Money talks in many different languages. Look around the campfire and see who's smiling while America burns.
Okay, looking at the Atlantic, and good article here. America's colleges are reaping what they sowed. Universities spent years saying that activism is not just welcome, but encouraged on their campuses. Well, students took them at their word.
Should we go electric?
I think we should go electrified with...
Colleges are reaping what they sowed, by Tyler Austin Harper, published on the 2nd of May, 2024. This audio article was produced by audio journalism app Noah, News Over Audio, and 11 Labs, using an AI voice.
Oh, shut up.
Nick Wilson, a sophomore at Cornell University, came to Ithaca, New York, to refine his skills as an activist. Attracted by both Cornell's labor relations school and the university's history of campus radicalism, he wrote his application essay about his involvement with the Democratic Socialists of America campaign to pass the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. When he arrived on campus, he witnessed any number of signs that Cornell shared his commitment to not just activism, but also militant protest, taking note of a plaque commemorating the armed occupation of Willard Straight Hall in 1969. Cornell positively romanticizes that event. The university library has published a Willard Straight Hall occupation study guide, and the Office of the Dean of Students once co-sponsored a panel on the protest. The school has repeatedly screened a documentary about the occupation, Agents of Change. The school's official newspaper, published by the University Media Relations Office, ran a series of articles honoring the 40th anniversary in 2009, and in 2019, Cornell held a year-long celebration for the 50th, complete with a commemorative walk, a dedication ceremony, and a public conversation with some of the occupiers. Occupation Anniversary Inspires Continued Progress, the Cornell Chronicle headline read. As Wilson has discovered firsthand, however, the school's hagiographical odes to prior protests has not prevented it from cracking down on pro-Palestine protests in the present. Now that he has been suspended for the very thing he told Cornell he came there to learn how to do, radical political organizing, he is left reflecting on the school's hypocrisies. That the theme of this school year at Cornell is freedom of expression adds a layer of grim humor to the affair. University leaders are in a bind. These protests are really dynamic situations that can change from minute to minute. Stephen Solomon, who
Yeah, you encourage anarchy, all right? You encourage disorder, all right? You encourage antisocial behavior, and you get more of it. But little interview here with a Cornell professor.
William Jacobson joins me now. So you went through a little bit. What's going on with you, Professor?
Yeah, well, when I spoke out against Black Lives Matter, I was targeted. But there's a much bigger problem now than the riots of 2020. We have on our campuses and in our cities a marriage between the extreme left that wants to tear us down, that hates the United States, is anti-American, anti-Western, anti-capitalist, and the Islamists who hate America, hate Israel. So everything you're seeing is really a social contagion. You have highly ideologically motivated leaders, organizers, and you have a bunch of students who, many of them, maybe not most, but many of them are going along because it's the thing to do. Hating Israel, hating the United States, chanting almost like cult-like phrases back and forth has captured a lot of the campuses. But this is a serious situation. It's the extreme left that wants to tear us down, almost Khmer Rouge, go back to year zero and start over, and the extreme Islamists who are worshiping Hamas who want to take us back to the 8th century. So this is really a wake-up call for this country, that what is happening now is not just a social contagion, it is extremely dangerous, and this marriage of the extreme left and the Islamists is not something that we've really seen before, and people need to recognize this is a serious situation.
So the Department of Justice tried to frame and concoct a connection between the right and Russia. Remember what they did there with Trump-Russia collusion? They did that fraudulently. There was never any connection between the right and Russia. Here, you have the radical left. There's a direct connection between Islamic forces. It's staring us right in the face. They're chanting it. They're financing it. They're encouraging it. How come the feds aren't looking at this the way they looked at the fake Trump-Russia collusion?
Yeah, that's a great question, because what we're seeing is right out in the open. They're not even trying to hide it. They're wearing Hamas headbands. They're praising Hamas. They are projecting on buildings, glory to the martyrs. They are chanting for an intifada, which was the bloody suicide bombing campaign that killed over 1,000 Israeli Jews. They chant from the river to the sea in English, but the Islamists who are chanting, when they chant it in Arabic, they chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab. So you have manipulation going on here. You have students who want to just be part of the crowd, just like in prior experiences. But it's worse now because the people who are driving this and manipulating it and speaking on really as the mouthpieces of Hamas and of the Iranian regime have the worst intentions for our country.
Yeah,
I don't think it's any mistake.
They sure do. And if you're a Republican waving a Russian flag, chanting, you know, praise Putin, oh, you're getting a knock on your door. These people, they don't mind. They let them do it all day. And it's just not right. There's a national security situation here. We got to look into it. Professor, thanks as always.
So my father did a PhD in apocalyptic, all right? Apocalyptic is the study of the end of the world. So my father specialized in the book of Daniel, in particular, Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, the cleansing of the sanctuary. And talking to that Anglo-Australian bloke, I think on Sunday, made me realize that throughout history, for thousands of years, thousands of men have essentially lived in caves waiting for the ultimate cataclysm, right? Waiting for the apocalypse, you know, waiting for the war to end all wars, the war of Gog versus Magog. There's just something in men in particular that resonates to the idea of one cataclysmic battle that's all they then need to think about. I guess it narrows your concerns and it reduces your vulnerability to life because all you care about is civil war or cataclysmic conflict or the apocalypse. And I see this in particular with political dissidents, but also chronically with under-owners, that their life gets smaller and smaller, and so that they care about less and less. And so there's this romantic dream of one war that will redeem everything, that means that you don't have to worry or be concerned with other parts of life. So you're not succeeding in any part of life, well, then you just focus on the ultimate apocalypse, keep small, reduce your vulnerability, essentially live in the cave, you know, wait for the one great conflict that somehow never comes. It's just irresistibly tempting. But there is a smarter way to live, and I like what Heidi Priebe has to say.
Reality by being dishonest with them about what's going on for us. So in the first scenario, where we are taking too much responsibility over our own lives, what often happens is that we get stuck in repetitive loops of thinking or feeling or experiencing the same things over and over and over again, because we're not accounting for all of the variables that are at play in our environment that are outside of our control. And because we aren't factoring those things in and staying aware of them and attuned to them, we're not able to make wise and integrated decisions about how to interact with our lives. So we don't have access to all of the information that we need in order to make our lives run smoothly. This is where a lot of neurotic patterns of thinking and behaving come from, a blind spot in the area of how our environment is impacting us. And then when we look at the interpersonal side of things, this is one that's going to be really hard to accept for those of us who are codependent or who have learned to relate to other people by solving their problems for them. But we are actually doing people an incredible disservice when we don't allow them to solve their problems for themselves.
And this is true for America, for low-performing groups, for Arab Americans and some parts of Muslim Americans and parts of African Americans and some parts of Mexican American life, all right? These groups have to overwhelmingly solve their own problems, all right? We're not doing them favors by subsidizing them and giving them affirmative action, all right? They need to work out their own fate with fear and trembling. And this overtaking of responsibility where America bends over backwards to try to subsidize its lowest performing, most criminally inclined groups is insane. We should stop taking responsibility for low achieving groups. They have to work things out on their own. If there are effective interventions, all right, I'm down for that. But overall, right, we've spent trillions of dollars and not made much progress.
In pretty much every scenario, the only way that we actually grow through our problems and learn and develop as people is by directly facing the consequences of our actions and being forced to pick up the pieces.
Right. So when you subsidize bad behavior, such as university college presidents have done with regard to these anti-Israel protests, when you subsidize bad behavior with undiscriminate doling out of welfare and subsidies and affirmative action, you get more bad behavior, right? When you overtake responsibility for low-performing groups and individuals who should be growing up and taking responsibility on their own, right, that holds back society, right? It reduces the incentives for hard-working, honest people to do the right thing if you keep, doling out money to people for doing the wrong thing.
This is how we develop self-responsibility in the process.
And I'd say the same for Israel. All right, I don't want America subsidizing Israel. I don't want America subsidizing Ukraine. I think we should be much more judicious with our foreign aid.
So if we are going into relationships thinking, I can't be honest with this person because they can't handle honesty, we are absolutely trying to play.
And we should be honest with low-performing individuals and low-performing groups. All right, America is not the primary problem for low-performing groups and low-performing individuals, right? We should be honest with them that you have to get your act together. You have to develop a new outlook in your community that is more attuned to higher levels of achievement, high levels of solidarity, more stable family lives.
God. We are denying people the learning experiences that they probably need the most in order to grow. And
Elliot Blatt, are you watching this? All right, bro? I mean, you're a wonderfully generous, compassionate, kind, empathic person, but sometimes we have to step back and stop denying people the experiences that they need to grow.
And so that's not a kind or loving thing to do, even though we may have internalized it as such at a young age. And again, in the latter half of this video, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of why we might be doing that and how we can check ourselves on it. But people who overtake responsibility are like moths to a flame for people who undertake responsibility and externalize a lot of their problems, right? So people who have the opposite patterning and believe that everything I'm feeling is the fault of someone else. And again, just like self-responsibility, externalizing is perfectly healthy when it is appropriate and accurate to the situation. So it's actually a very good thing to be able to notice and pay attention to and communicate what things in your external environment are impacting you in what ways. But, of course, it's also important to be able to take responsibility for changing what we can change. So that's where we end up at that secure fusion point of taking the right amount of responsibility. However, once again, if you are someone who overtakes it, you're probably attracting a lot of people who undertake it. And it might feel like you are helping those people by shielding them from the consequences of their actions, because it's obvious to you that they just don't have the skills to take the responsibility that they ought to be taking, maybe because they have trauma or whatever it is. But when we shield an externalizer from the consequences of their actions, I kind of think of it as akin to handing someone who is an alcoholic a drink that has alcohol in it and saying to them, this is a non-alcoholic beverage. You are warping their experience of reality. If someone is externalizing and telling you you are the cause of their problems, and you're saying, you know what, I'll accept that, I'll say that yes, I am, and I'll go with it, it's the same thing. You are warping their experience of reality. And a warped experience of reality is significantly more dysregulating than a true experience of reality that is painful. Painful truths are still regulating for our systems because we're responding to what's actually happening. So we're going to move into how to start changing this cycle and taking the right amount of responsibility, both for your relationships and your place within relationships, and also for your life in general. So how do we get into right relationship with self-responsibility? The first thing we want to start paying attention to is noticing our motivations when we find ourselves wanting to overtake responsibility, particularly interpersonally. So this might mean asking ourselves questions like, am I doing this because A, I fear that the other person will make a choice that is incompetent or that I'm unsatisfied with or hurt by if I let them take control? So do I lack trust in this person? And if so, why am I choosing to be so close to them? And that can be a really fruitful question to sit with and integrate. Am I trying to have a relationship with someone who lacks the ability either to regulate themselves or to deeply see and understand me and meet me where I'm at because I feel threatened by equality in relationships? Because if you're taking on a relationship with someone who you fundamentally believe, when you're really honest with yourself, is significantly inferior to you intellectually or emotionally, you are by default going to have to overtake responsibility in that relationship. But the real question we want to sit with here is, what am I getting out of that? What am I getting out of having an inherently unequal power dynamic? And that's probably going to be a much more important question to sit with than how do I fix everything in this relationship? You might want to ask yourself, am I overtaking responsibility in one area in this relationship because I'm undertaking responsibility somewhere else?
All right, that's what my therapist said to me. So, Josh Randall, thanks for the Norm MacDonald clip on David Letterman's show. Don't want to mess with any copyright violations. But I remember my therapist said to me once, and I've never forgotten, you think you're so radical in your politics because you're so passive in your life, all right? We can't be active and passionate and putting a lot of energy into all different areas of our life. So I do notice in myself and in other people, right, the more passive I get in my life, all right, the more predisposed I become to radical solutions. I wonder if I can get away with playing this from David Letterman.
Now, Norm, we're running out of time, but I would be remiss here if I didn't bring up something. People have been bothering me about this for months and months. People come on the show and they say, the next time you see Norm MacDonald, he's got some tremendous stories about the great Bob Uecker. Now, do you have a story you can tell us about Bob Uecker? Voice of the Milwaukee Brewers.
Well, Bob Uecker is one of my best friends. He's a great man. I know Artie told a story when he was here, and Bob was not too thrilled with that. But
it's Artie Lang you're talking
Artie
about.
Lang, yeah. But Bob is a very, very funny man, and I often go in the booth with him, you know.
Oh, sure.
So one time we were there, and John Fogerty was in the audience. You know, a fortunate son, you know. So John Fogerty was there, so Bob Uecker is a very interesting guy. He thinks of everybody as the same. He doesn't think of people as stars or anything like that. He's a very down-to-earth guy. So he was talking to me, and he says, hey, man, you know that guy? I go, yeah. He goes, that's John Fogerty, rock and roll singer. So I go, yeah, I know who it is. He goes, yeah, man. He goes, but I played in a golf tournament with him. He goes, you probably think of him as some that likes to bite the heads off of chickens, but this guy can.
That's exactly how I think of him.
This guy can get it out of the sand trap like nobody's business. So he goes, he's got a hell of a set of pipes on him. He goes, come the seventh inning stretch, I'll have him up here. He'll sing for you. So I said, no, Bob, don't do that. Like, don't have him come up and sing for me, please, you know. He goes, what's matter, man? Don't you even know who he is? He got all mad. So I go, yes, Bob, I know who he is. He did Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Yeah.
He goes, yeah, he did all that.
Okay, that's going to do it.